Welcome back to Dentro la Storia, the channel for those who love contemporary history. Today marks a civil anniversary, February 10th. The Day of Remembrance is a day that was established by law over 20 years ago to pass on the memory of the Julian-Dalmatian exodus as a very painful solution for the Italian people after the end of the Second World War. But what exactly doesn't add up in this story? What needs to be looked into? There's a lot, because unfortunately sometimes in historical interpretation, something is omitted to celebrate something else, and if not to celebrate it, then to give it emphasis, almost as if the historical narrative should serve other purposes. And so, what happens sometimes? That manipulation, because that's what it's called, manipulation, gets to the point of denying some Venetian facts or diminishing them, erasing them, removing them, or covering them up, simply with a veil. In order not to explain everything, it's as if what you want to remember is only a reason for blind hatred, for brutality, without any explanation. We at Dentro la Storia delve into history in all its aspects, and we never forget anything. That's why today, on the occasion of the Day of Remembrance, we decided to dedicate a video to the Pola Exodus, focusing on one episode, the Vergarolla Massacre, but also looking at the whole context. It's not an easy video to make. Giovanni and I realized this when we thought about it, but it was a necessary video, so I asked for your patience. And let's dive together into this story of pain. Our story can only begin far back in time, so we have to go back well before the Great War to the ethnic, linguistic, and cultural makeup of that great melting pot that was the Austro-Hungarian Empire. An empire that was held together by a very different, delicate system of imperial patents, which were nothing more than concessions, allowing the practice of free trade, religious worship, schooling, and so on. This system provided for a very delicate but fairly balanced equilibrium among the various different groups that made up the empire, and on the eastern shore of the Adriatic, in Istria and Dalmatia. It also meant the possibility for the Italian-speaking community to emerge as a dominant cultural example, to the point that from the countryside, which was much poorer both economically and culturally, there was a constant migration toward the coast of groups, initially Slavic-speaking, or at least of Slavic ethnicity, who sought assimilation with the Italian-speaking communities, even changing their first and last names just to access certain benefits. This is how the Adriatic question, the Eastern question, was born. And when the Austro-Hungarian Empire collapsed in 1918 after the Great War, Istria became one of the symbolic territories of the European divide within the short 20th century. Pola, in particular, which is a multi-ethnic port city and also the main imperial naval base, is annexed to Italy, along with Trieste and most of Venetia Julia. The official rhetoric of the time spoke of redeemed lands, but as we have seen, the social reality was much more complex. This delicate, fragile balance, made up of languages, identities, and allegiances, is something that has settled over the centuries. But it was guaranteed by a central government in Vienna, which for a long time granted wide local freedoms in exchange for general subordination. The advent of fascism in Italy definitively broke this balance. We've already seen this in another video on the channel. The burning of the Narodny Dom in Trieste, the first real act of squad violence in Italy. Istria becomes a laboratory for integral border nationalism. Slavic language schools are closed, and the public use of Slovenian and Croatian is banned, just as it happened in South Tyrol. For Germans, surnames and place names undergo forced Italianization. There is a systematic repression of non-Italian cultural and political associations. These are not isolated incidents. It is a deliberate policy, supported by the state, which is now a dictatorship, and by the local authorities, who are a direct extension of this dictatorship. It is a real administrative and cultural violence that, instead of bringing the communities together into a single state, only serves to radicalize identities, fueling national hatred and preparing the ground for a future reckoning between opposing nationalisms. This is the real problem. because Croatian and Slovenian nationalism did not arise after the war, from 45 onwards. They were born much earlier, already at the end of the 1800s, in response to Italian irredentism. They were provoked at the time of the Imperial Regio, the government of Vienna, which had tried to restore balance through a theory of opposing extremisms or opposing nationalisms. If you prefer, it was a very delicate situation. It further exacerbated the divisions and distinctions, all to the advantage of a single community and at the expense of the others. It did nothing but lay the groundwork for what would come later. In 1941, Fascist Italy attacks Yugoslavia. It's a treacherous attack. Yugoslavia had signed an agreement with the Axis, but renounced it within a few days. We talked about this in the video dedicated to the boy king Karađorđević. You can also find that on the channel. Yugoslavia collapses within a few days and Italy takes part in the dismemberment. Dalmatia, Slovenia, and Montenegro are zones of occupation, an occupation that quickly takes on certain characteristics. Brutal roundups, reprisals, arson, destruction of villages, deportations. Concentration camps for civilians are created in Treviso, Udine, and Rab, an island. Thousands die in these camps, and most of them are Slovenes and Croats, which only makes the situation even worse. I want to emphasize one fact. This chapter, that of the Italian concentration camps for Slovenian and Croatian citizens, is a chapter that has been removed from Italian public memory. Today we celebrate the Day of Remembrance, but no one remembers those camps. However, we need to understand, we need to know what happened. Because for large segments of the Slavic population, Italy, from 43 to 45, is not just a defeated power, but also a former occupier responsible for war crimes. The eastern border does not experience the end of the conflict as a peaceful liberation, but as a violent transition between two dominations. Opposing nationalisms, there was Italian fascist nationalism, and Slavic nationalism is emerging more and more. In the spring of 1945, Tito's Yugoslav partisans, following the collapse of all Axis forces, occupied much of Istria, as well as the city of Trieste. This is followed by a phase of purges, arrests, and summary executions that initially target only fascists or their collaborators, but also affect ordinary citizens, especially those of Italian ethnicity or language, because they are perceived as hostile or potential enemies of the new regime, of the new order that is taking shape. There is an enclave, however, that at least initially is not affected by all this. It's the city of Pola, where the situation is different because it is a city under Allied military administration. While waiting for a final decision on the border issue, on where to draw the new lines, formally, Pola is a territory under British-American control. Basically, it is a suspended city where tensions continue to coexist, where there is opposing propaganda, where there are infiltrations by Yugoslav secret services and the OSNA police, where there is daily fear, where the Italian community does not realize that it is making a very serious mistake. Between 1945 and 1947, peace treaties were discussed, the redefinition of borders, political regimes, and the reorganization of Europe. Well, in Pola, a newspaper, Larina, tries to force the issue, publishing on the front page a long editorial titled in 7 columns, either Italy or exile. The Pola community that identifies with and reads that newspaper wants nothing more than to force the issue, to revive Italian nationalism, to demand international recognition of their identity. The problem is that certain demands can only be made if there is political backing. But Italy at that time, even though it had the status of co-belligerent in the last conflict, was a defeated state. And it lacks the political strength to get anything. It can only negotiate for less harsh conditions in the peace treaties. This is the real problem. And how does world public opinion react? It turns the other way. It has no interest. It doesn't want to make any sacrifices. A matter that is seen as marginal, peripheral, compared to the tensions that are already developing between East and West. A city like Pola isn't worth half the world. It's harsh to say, but that's how it is. And on the other side, how do Tito and the Yugoslavs experience it? They experience it very badly. They see it as something forced upon them, an attempt to force their hand, to hide behind British American protection in order to deprive the reborn nation, Yugoslavia, which will no longer be a kingdom but a socialist republic, of a fundamental city, an outlet to the sea, a port. For what purpose? To continue to satisfy a nationalism that is seen with a single fascist label is another exaggeration. Not all Polisan nationalists are fascists, quite the opposite. The problem is that by exacerbating tempers, dividing, polarizing, all you're doing is seeking a dichotomy, and therefore confrontation. And in confrontations, it's unpleasant to say, but true, the one with greater strength always prevails over those who have no support. And so we come to that moment, that decisive moment. The Vergarolla Massacre happened on August 18, 1946. Vergarolla is a place near Pola. It's a beach just a few kilometers from the center of Pola, and it's a beach frequented almost exclusively by the Italian community. There are many young people, but also families, who go to Vergarolla to swim, sunbathe, and relax. Sporting events are also organized there, mainly swimming competitions. Moreover, the beach is far from the eyes of the international press. They are looking elsewhere, focusing on the peace talks, paying attention to what's happening in China. The beach is the ideal target, both ethnically and politically, to send a message. There's another factor to consider. On that beach, in one corner of the beach, naval mines have been piled up. You might wonder, was it the Allies? These are mines that were dredged from the waters off Pola and from the port itself. Those mines are inert. The percussion caps and fuses have all been removed, so there would be nothing left to keep. Moreover, the mines are certainly not scattered along the beach, but gathered in a fenced area. The children play around that fence, even though the adults always tell them not to overdo it, not to take risks, not to get hurt. But even the adults themselves have gotten used to it by now. Those mines have been there for months. At first they were frightening, but now people hardly notice them anymore. They've become an integral part of the landscape. A technical intervention is needed to reactivate those mines, with detonators that aren't there at that moment, but that doesn't mean they can never be there again. It's August 18th, 1946, early afternoon. A terrible explosion occurs in Vergarolla. It's an explosion that could be heard all the way into the city, and it's an explosion that will go down in history, that explosion. Those mines that suddenly explode while a youth sports event is taking place on the beach lead to a massacre. Pola does not forget it. It's 2:10 post-meridiem when the explosion happens, and that explosion causes over 60 confirmed deaths. But there were probably more, maybe even as many as 100. Many bodies that are thrown into the air fall back down in torn pieces, making them hard to identify. The ambulances racing frantically from the beach to the hospital and back struggle to clarify the full scale of the massacre. It's an apocalyptic scene. Dismembered bodies, the screams, the blood, families that are destroyed, children looking for their parents, parents searching for their children, even doctors seeing their own dead children arrive at the hospital. The despair is total. Who did this and why? Why target young people, children, families? Those who survived that massacre can never return to the life they had before. And not only because some are left with permanent injuries like amputations or scars, that will be there forever. There is a deep psychological trauma, but it's clear that massacre wasn't simply an act of wanting to cause harm. They wanted to do something more. They wanted to send a message. They wanted to push the Italian community that had embraced that editorial Italy, or Exodus, precisely towards Exodus, to leave in exile out of Pola, which was supposed to become a Yugoslav city, from Vergarolla onwards, from that August 18, 1946, to February 10, 1947, the day when the peace treaty is signed, handing over the Istrian lands to Yugoslavia. The exodus, even from Pola, becomes not just a possible option, but a recommended and mandatory one. It is a historic turning point. From that moment on, there is a constant desire to leave, to get far away from where people had suffered. But let's return to the matter of responsibility. Who has been the most accredited historiography? Today, it converges on a single hypothesis, that of an attack organized by the OSNA, the secret political police, Yugoslavia. The goal, in fact, was to terrorize the Italian population, speed up the flight of Italians, and make the annexation to Yugoslavia irreversible. Unfortunately, there is no judicial evidence of what happened, but the circumstantial documentary and testimonial framework is solid enough to direct all suspicions in that direction, beyond what could be the binary interpretation of the Vergarolla incident and the eastern border. We need to understand how the two opposing nationalisms, Italian, which later became fascism, and Yugoslav, which later became the Tito movement, did nothing but destroy what once was a peaceful interethnic coexistence, or at least a balanced coexistence. Fascism destroyed this coexistence. It repressed and humiliated the Slavic populations during the war. It wanted concentration camps. The Titoist movement used political terrorism against Italian civilians, carried out summary purges, and pursued a cleansing that was not ethnic, but national, disguised as a revolution. Vergarolla cannot be defined as an act of revenge, but as an act of strategic violence against the defenseless population. They had two faults, the first intrinsic, but it can't even be called a real fault, that is, being Italian. The other was having embraced a blind, deaf, or mute policy, either Rome or exile. For a long time, no one spoke about the Vergarolla Massacre, just as no one spoke about the Italian concentration camps. Only thanks to the work of various historians, Raul Pupo, Roberto Spazzali, Jose Piriwech. With the opening of the Anglo-American archives, Italian concentration camps and Vergarolla have once again become central to the debate. Within that day of remembrance, which unfortunately has become, instead of an opportunity to reflect on the history of the eastern border, an occasion to perpetuate hatred, in other words, exactly the opposite of what it should be. And we come to the final gesture, the final act. On February 10, 1947, when General Robert de Winton, the Governor-General of the city of Pola, an Englishman, is shot and killed by Maria Pasquinelli, a fascist supporter who shoots and kills as a gesture of protest against the assignment of Pola to Yugoslavia. To kill a man who had done everything to protect the Italian population. Of course, he wasn't able to prevent the Vergarolla Massacre, but still he tried to prevent the violence that had happened in other Istrian cities and in Trieste. For what? For a decision made elsewhere? Robert de Winton is the last innocent victim, and not even Italian, of the Eastern question. You could almost call him the last victim of Vergarolla. Robert de Winton. He pays for faults he doesn't have. It's a climate of hatred, all going in one direction. It's not just Croatian or Slovenian hatred against Italians. It's hatred between several communities. It's a hatred that has been fueled over time by different agitators, by people who fanned the flames for their own purposes. Nothing but to ruin what had been a successful model, even if fragile, even if delicate, of coexistence. Maria Pasquinelli, who thinks she's a heroine, but in reality she's just a murderer. She does nothing but perform the final act of hatred, making the exiles and their descendants pay for a long time the price of that hatred, which is contempt. If you'll allow me the play on words, because the exiles, those who flee and come to Italy, to the Italian Republic, are seen as a nuisance. They are judged a priori as remnants of fascism. They are seen not even as a necessary evil, but as something that must be swallowed. By force, they are seen as unwanted guests, also because of Maria Pasquinelli, because instead of seeking dialogue once again, violence was chosen. The force of arms, which never has any justification, is never a real method to smooth out differences, to resolve international issues. This is the sick legacy of the eastern border. This is the story of Vergarolla. It's the story of Pola. Dead as an innocent because of others' faults, because of others' interests, because of international games, because of political games. Because in the end, that's the price. It's not paid by those who drew the border lines on the maps. They don't pay it. Those who wanted the concentration camps, or those who used the foibe in different ways, over and over again, or those who placed the detonators at Vergarolla. The bill is paid by others. It's paid by those who died in the camps, in the foibe at Vergarolla, by those who had to leave everything, who ran away, who were met with insults and spit, These are truly the men, women, children, and elderly who paid the price. Let's not forget that. So, if we really want to reflect on the Day of Remembrance today, which is the Day of Remembrance, let's remember everything. And above all, let's try not to repeat what happened. Those victims, from the children and young people of Vergarolla to Robert de Winton, never deserved any of that, nor do they today. If you really want to honor their memory, start by studying what happened on the eastern border, and in the end, after you have studied, repeat never again.